Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Tamika and today I have something a little bit different for you, but something I hope to have more of in the future. So this is going to be a sew along of the free pattern, the Pua Tank from Paradise Patterns. I am so excited to finally be doing a sew along for you. You wouldn't believe the number of these that I've started and then just haven't finished for whatever reason. But today I am making the Blummer Tank from Paradise Patterns. I'm wearing one that I have made already. It is a really great basic to have in the wardrobe. It's a really classic style, kind of almost racerback tank with a wide neckband and armbands. And yeah, it's one of my go-to patterns. Now you can get this pattern for free if you sign up for the Paradise Patterns newsletter over on the website. I'll link below so you can get that pattern. Today I will be making it from this lovely fabric here. This is a rayon spandex, I believe, from East Coast Fabrics that has been sitting in my stash for a little while and just needed to be used. I'm going to make size 4, which is the standard size that I've been making out of this one. I fit perfectly into those measurements, 34, 27, 38, and with an upper bust of a 32. So I'm going to jump straight into it. Don't forget to like the video, you can subscribe down below and turn on bell notifications to know when I post. But we're going to get straight on into the making. As always, I start by pre-washing my fabric, so I'll usually also tumble dry it if there's a chance that the finished garment will end up in the dryer, which, let's be honest, there is always a chance. So I do that just to try and avoid any further shrinkage once it's finished. Then it's time to start cutting. Rather than folding each of the selvages into the middle like the instructions suggest, I prefer to start at one side and fold over just enough fabric to fit my pattern piece. So I'll cut that out and then do the same for the next piece, folding over just enough for it to fit. This means that I'm usually only using as much fabric as I need, and I won't need to be cutting 2 gaping holes in the middle of the fabric. The stripes here aren't a directional print either, so I can flip the pattern pieces up and down whichever direction I need for it to be most economical. Then is the neck binding and 2 sleeve bindings. Again, I'm doubling the fabric over here just for ease and efficiency of cutting. And then on to the sewing. So I start by attaching the front and back together at the shoulder and side seams, with right sides facing, of course. I'm using my overlocker for this, but you can also use a sewing machine with a zigzag or a stretch stitch. And always be careful when you're sewing with stretch fabrics not to pull or stretch too much to avoid having those awkward wavy seams. While I'm at the machine, I'm also going to join together the short end of all of the bindings to make little loops. Once they're sewn, it's time to press all of those seams to one side. I really think pressing is one of the most important parts of sewing and is key to getting a professional looking finish. Here I am using a sleeve roll to press my seams, but you don't need one of these. You can do it straight on your ironing board. You can hook it over the end of your board. You can even roll up a cotton towel and press it over that if you really want to. If I'd sewn my bindings on my machine, I would also press these open rather than to one side. That'll just reduce bulk later when I'm attaching them, but I didn't, so I'm just pressing to the side. Next, I want to quarter my bindings. So what I'm going to do is take some pins. If you work with knit fabrics frequently, I highly recommend investing in some stretch pins. They glide into your jersey and stretch fabric so much more easily. They're essentially like a ballpoint pin, like you'd use a ballpoint needle in your machine. So I've flattened out my sleeve binding here with the seam to one side. I'm going to place a pin in that fold. This marks the halfway point. So So then I'm going to unfold this, lining up my seam line with the pin and flattening it out again. So these two folds are now my quarters. So again, I'll just place a pin to mark this side and one in there, and repeat this with all of the other bindings. We're also going to quarter the holes on our top. So for the neckline, I'm starting by finding the center front and center back. To do that, I match up the shoulder seams and then flatten it out. So this is the center front, and I'll mark it with a pin. I could have done this step back at the cutting out stage when it was still folded over, either with a notch or a pen mark or even a pin, but I didn't, so we're doing this now. Then we're gonna do the same thing at the back there, finding center back and popping a pin in. From there, I unfold it like we did with all of the bindings and line up those 2 points, so center front with center back, and that'll give me my quarters. It's really important not to just use the shoulder seams as your quarter point, because as you can see here, the shoulder point falls higher than the quarter point. We're going to be using all of these to line up the edges with the binding, so it's really important that they're all even. To find the quarters on the armholes, I'm using the side seam as my first point and walking the fabric along the edges, being really careful not to stretch it, and keep going until it falls naturally to a fold. Again, mark that spot with a pin. Once again, place those 2 points together, flatten out the fabric, and that is the quarters. Now that they're all divided evenly, I'm going to match up those points on the bindings with the points on their corresponding hole, making sure that it's always right sides together. Then between those points, I'm just gently stretching the binding until the edge of the fabric lines up with the edge of the binding, but not so far that it's stretching the arm or neck hole. There's a really fine line between being taut and lined up and being stretched. So for this step, you can use as many or as few pins as you like. I would probably not use quite as many as I did this time the next time, just because it's a little bit easier to feed through the machine when there aren't quite as many. Now to actually attach the bands, I'm again using my overlocker. This was actually the first time I'd done this step on my overlocker. Previously I'd just done it on my sewing machine, but I think having the overlocked edge really helped with the sturdiness of the bands in the finished product. So highly recommend. Again, if you don't have an overlocker, this can all be done on your sewing machine. I'm also making sure to sew with the binding on the top side rather than underneath. It just makes it a little easier to stretch just the binding without stretching the top. And this is what it looks like so far. I'm also just going to overlock the bottom edge before I switch over to my sewing machine for the remainder of the sewing. Alright, sewing machine is ready to go, and I need to do a second row of stitching around the bands with the right sides together still. I'm using a stretch stitch on my machine, so that little lightning bolt, and sewing once again with the band on top. So to really try and avoid stretching out those arm and neck holes, I'm making sure that the bottom layer, so the actual top, is nice and flat, and then I'm just gently stretching the binding to fit as I go. For the next bit, I have strayed a little bit from the instructions. So instead of folding the bindings over and lining up the raw edge with the stitching, I'm actually just folding the binding all the way over the overlocked edge. If I just line it up with the stitching, I find I have a little bit extra at that folded edge. So I'm just, rolling it between my fingers really gently to make sure that it's nice and smooth and not too tight on that edge, and pinning it in place. Then I'm going to sew it down with my twin needle. So I've got my machine threaded and ready to go. I'm just going to change my stitch settings to a straight stitch at the center needle position, and my machine has a twin needle button, so I'm going to press that. I'm also going to increase my stitch length to about 3.5, which is kind of like my go-to for top stitching. Make sure to check your machine manual to see if you need to change any settings for your twin needle or if it has particular stitch settings that it recommends. As you can see, it gives a really nice row of double stitching on the top and it looks like a zigzag on the bottom. So that means that your fabric still has some stretch. Once the bindings are attached, I'm going to trim close to that seam. The best way that I've found to do it is to turn your scissors so that they're parallel with the main fabric, and the seam allowance that you're wanting to trim kind of runs perpendicular through the blades. I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but hopefully you can see what I'm doing in the video. And the final step is to hem and press everything, of course. For the hem, I folded the fabric over 1/2 inch and then another inch and sewed it again with my twin needle. And here it is. I am so happy with how it's turned out. They say practice makes perfect, so this is the 3rd time that I've actually made this pattern, and it's probably my best yet. I often get wrinkles through here because I've obviously stretched the armbands and neckband as I've been sewing, so do your very best not to do that. But yeah, if it happens, it happens. Sewing, you're not going to get it perfect every time. So I'm stoked with how this one's turned out. If you want to give it a try, I will link the pattern down below. I think I said earlier you can get it free if you sign up for the Paradise Patterns newsletter. Otherwise, I think it is also available for purchase on the Etsy shop. So thanks for joining me today. I hope you have a fabulous week and I will see you next time. Bye.